of us that went to grad school together have landed ourselves over here in Seattle. So it's fun to see old friends and colleagues. And I am happy to have the chance to talk today about my work focused on arsenic in food, water, plants, and animals, and the impact that has on human and ecosystem health. Let's move this bar down here. So arsenic is a global carcinogenic contaminant. So it's found everywhere around the world. It's naturally occurring in soils and sediments. And we also often think of it as a legacy contaminant because in past there were activities that released arsenic out into the environment. These included smelting, mining, industrial discharge. And then it also turns out that we used to use arsenic as an herbicide. So there's been this release of this naturally occurring arsenic, kind of releasing that out into the environment and increasing its concentration in these localized areas. And then it's sitting there and we continue to be suffering the consequences of that kind of past action. So that's what makes it a legacy contaminant. So arsenic negatively affects the health. If you consume it, it can cause arsenicosis, which manifests itself externally with these types of lesions, which I'm showing on hands and feet. But ultimately, it's what it does to the inside of your body that is the most damaging. So this slide summarizes all the different functions of our body that get impacted by arsenic. So it can impact our nervous system, cardiovascular system, renal system, the skin, which was that picture I showed, our endocrine system, respiratory, can cause liver cancer. And then we have found out that in children, it can also have an impact on developmental processes and lead to increased cancer risk as those children grow into adults. So it is a bad actor. We don't want to have it inside of our bodies having this negative impact on a lot of our different bodily systems. So let's think back about arsenic in the environment. I mentioned it exists in soils and sediments, and often if it stays in the soil and sediment, it doesn't tend to pose too much of an impact on things. The one risk is often if children end up kind of ingesting that soil or sediment, and this can happen if they're playing in the dirt and then put their hands into their mouth. So that is the one exposure pathway when arsenic is remaining in this solid phase. But most of the time, arsenic ends up causing problems once it gets released off of those soils and sediments and moves into water. Because once arsenic is dissolved in water, we can drink it in our drinking water. We can have it in our irrigation water. We apply it to our plants. If it's in soil water, just surrounding the roots of plants, it can be taken up by those plants and make its way into the grain of those plants. And it can also make its way into aquatic ecosystems. And the reaction, which is responsible for this movement of arsenic off of soils and sediments and into the water, is one that I'm showing here. So this is a redox reaction, which is performed by microbes living in the environment. So this is called microbial respiration. And the microbes are doing exactly what we do as humans to live. So they're taking organic carbon, which exists naturally in the environment. We get organic carbon from the grocery store, and they're oxidizing that into carbon dioxide. So that is half of the reaction. To complete the reaction, they need to reduce something. And we use oxygen in our respiration reaction. We reduce oxygen into water. Microbes are more flexible than us humans, and they can use lots of other elements and chemicals besides oxygen. And one very common electron acceptor are these iron minerals that exist in the soil. So the microbes target iron 3, which is a solid phase mineral, and they reduce it into iron 2, which is a dissolved species. It turns out that arsenic and actually a lot of other metals associate with these iron oxide minerals in soils and sediments. And so what happens is when the microbes are oxidizing that organic carbon and reducing that iron, they're dissolving that iron mineral through that reaction. And you can just conceptually envision that, you know, if you have something attached to a mineral and that mineral starts to dissolve, you're going to release the element that was attached. And so this reaction, primarily by targeting iron and reducing iron, ends up mobilizing arsenic off of these soils and sediments and into the surrounding water. So it's a microbial respiration redox reaction, and it's equivalent to what we're doing as humans, but it's happening in soils all around the world. So this single microbial reaction, maybe I shouldn't say single, but this kind of redox reaction has had impacts on groundwater quality around the world. So this map, which I'm showing here, are areas around the world where we have arsenic, elevated concentrations of arsenic in groundwater associated with this redox reaction. And there's this part of the world here, Bangladesh and West Bengal, which has been really impacted by this reaction and the associated contamination of arsenic in groundwater. And that is largely because of the history of development in Bangladesh. So groundwater is now the primary source of both drinking and irrigation water within the country. And that was set up back in the 1970s because aid organizations had come in and their goal was to reduce the high rate of waterborne diseases associated with drinking surface water. And so the thought was, let's move everyone off of surface water and put them onto groundwater. And so that effort was very successful and actually did reduce the rate of waterborne diseases in the country. And to the point now that I mentioned that groundwater is the primary water source. Unfortunately, it was discovered, sorry, my cat is, unfortunately, it was discovered after this large scale conversion to groundwater occurred that the groundwater there was contaminated with arsenic. And so this meant then that there were millions of people in the country of Bangladesh drinking water with unsafe levels of arsenic in it. So we're getting all these people exposed to arsenic, which has all those negative effects that I talked about on our body systems. And just to put this in context, someone wrote back in 2002 in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, the scale of this environmental disaster is greater than any seen before. It's beyond the accidents at Bhopal, India in 1984 and Chernobyl, Ukraine in 1986. And this is just because of the large scale, the mass number of people basically being exposed to these unsafe levels of arsenic in their drinking water. So it was a pretty serious problem. And, you know, while these people were suffering because of this arsenic exposure, there was kind of a large effort to come and understand the problem and try to develop solutions around that. And in the process, we learned a lot about arsenic and how it behaves in the environment. And so just to kind of put a little bit of history here, what I'm showing is publications with the word arsenic in them, normalized by all publications at that point in time. This is just like based on a Web of Science search. And so it actually turned out that back here in the, like, you know, I don't know what, 1983, someone actually noted the occurrence of these skin lesions on someone's hand living in Bangladesh. So this documented case of arsenicosis existed, but it didn't get published. It didn't get disseminated until 1995. which is this point here. And at that point in time, there was an international conference that was held to raise awareness around this problem. And you can see that kind of after that point in time, there was a large increase in the amount of knowledge being generated about arsenic. A pretty important report came out here in 2000. The British Geological Survey traveled all around Bangladesh, sampling as many wells as they could get and analyzing those wells for arsenic. And that those results are displayed here in this picture. So red, basically, and orange represent wells with unsafe levels of arsenic in them. So you can see that it was widespread across the country. And basically this report determined that there were 57 million people drinking water with unsafe levels of arsenic. As mentioned, I studied and did my PhD on the issue of arsenic contamination in Bangladesh. So my work occurred here kind of at the peak of this knowledge generation around arsenic. I was focused on identifying the source of this organic carbon, which was fueling this microbial reaction. So that was kind of really what I was focused on in my research. Focus on arsenic has started to diminish over time, but we're still continuing to learn a lot. For example, in 2010, a pretty shocking publication for those of us in the field came out. We knew that arsenic was harmful, but we didn't really recognize how harmful it was. And basically what they found by comparing populations in Bangladesh that were exposed to arsenic in their water and those that weren't, arsenic increased the rate of death by 34 to 68% in Bangladesh in those populations they were studying. So the arsenic contamination problem in Bangladesh really propelled a lot of study and understanding of arsenic. And through that, we learned a lot about how arsenic behaves in the environment and all the impacts it can have on our bodies. But unfortunately, this was all happening because of this really terrible situation and exposure of an entire country basically to a geogenic contaminant. Okay, so we had people drinking water with unsafe levels of arsenic. Around this time, people started to realize, like, well, we're also have arsenic in the irrigation water, which is being used to irrigate all of these rice fields. So what does that mean for the rice, which is being grown in Bangladesh? And so there was effort focused in this area as well. And basically what was found is that in general, when arsenic concentrations in soils increase, we tend to see concentrations of arsenic in rice grain also increase. So it's not too surprising. This is from one study here, soil arsenic on the x-axis, grain arsenic on the y-axis. Things are on a log scale. So, and then I think what was also interesting and surprising for the academic community was that grain yields also decreased as soil arsenic concentrations increased. So arsenic is not just bad for humans, it's also bad for rice plants. So basically, as rice get exposed to more arsenic, they get more stressed and the grain yields drop. So this problem has an impact not just on health by consumption of arsenic, but also on health by the amount of food that can be produced. So these two studies, which I showed, were in Bangladesh. So then researchers kind of zoomed out and started looking at rice grown around the world. And so they went to marketplaces around the world, collected rice grains, and analyzed those for arsenic. And so I've just taken some data from those papers. This shows the distribution of grain arsenic in Bangladesh. And then here are concentrations of grain arsenic here in the United States. And then this top panel is a model global distribution. So they kind of took all the data from all the different countries and kind of put it all together and said, this is kind of globally what arsenic looks like in rice. Okay, so you might be looking at this and notice, my goodness, rice grown here in the United States has more arsenic than rice grown in Bangladesh, right? So this is rice in the US, rice in Bangladesh. So we have more arsenic in our rice than those in Bangladesh. And that's perhaps initially surprising because I said, well, they're irrigating their rice fields with arsenic. So what's going on here in the United States? Well, before I get there, I'll tell you, it turns out that we applied arsenic-based herbicides to cotton fields, predominantly in the southeast of the United States, and then those fields got converted into rice fields. So we're actually growing a lot of our rice on fields that received this legacy application of arsenic. So we have rice being grown on pretty contaminated soils. And so that's largely why we have these high levels of arsenic in our rice grain. So what do these concentrations in rice actually mean? So unlike water, where there is a strict drinking water standard, there is not really much of a standard for arsenic in food. In 2016, the FDA did come out with a guideline saying that if you're going to use rice in infant foods, so make like infant rice pudding, or like my kids love to chew on these little rice crackers. So anything that's going to go into infants can't have concentrations that exceed what I've plotted here on this line. So what you can see is that most of the rice grown here in the United States exceeds this kind of threshold put forward for infant food. A study came out in 2013, which marked this concentration here as a point where you start to see genotoxic damage. So basically that means what they started to see was damage to DNA. And then the idea is that if you damage the DNA, that can cause a mutation, and then that can also cause cancer. So it's kind of the first step towards cancer. And this was a pretty important paper because it really was the first paper directly connecting arsenic in rice to some sort of health consequence. A question?
I do. Thank you for letting me have to interrupt. Is there a significant difference in arsenic concentration between rice grown in the South with arsenic, like you stated, and that grown in California, which has?
Yeah, I'll get into that. Cool. Yes. Yeah.
Thank
you. So I will talk about kind of rice grown in different locations. But in my group, one thing we've really been interested in is what's climate change, this kind of warmer future that we're moving into, what kind of impact is it going to have on this problem of arsenic contamination in rice? And that's motivated, right, by the fact that we're expecting temperatures to get warmer as we move into the future. Here are just kind of two of the scenarios. Kind of the worst case for the IPCC report is this RCP 8.5. And then over here, I'm showing globally where rice is grown. Most of it is being grown here in South and Southeast Asia. And that is overlapping, you know, with areas of the world where we can see temperatures increase, you know, by up to 5 degrees, for example. So we know we're going to be producing rice under warmer temperatures. And the reason why we care about temperature is that because microbial reactions speed up with warmer temperatures. And so, as I mentioned, this reaction, which is mobilizing arsenic off of soil and sediments and moving it into the water, is mediated by microbes. And so they're going to do that reaction more quickly as temperatures increase, or that was our hypothesis when we moved into the work. And so that means our thought was that, well, okay, we're going to get more movement of arsenic into water. That will mean more uptake of arsenic by the roots of the rice plant, which will mean more movement and translocation of arsenic up through the rice tissue, including up into grain. So to test this idea, a graduate student in my group, Yasmin Farhat, conducted a plant growth experiment. These are rice plants that she grew under in growth chambers where we controlled the temperature. So what I'm showing here are the 4 average temperatures that we grew the plants at. This is kind of like what temperatures are around currently, and then up to 33 degrees. And then we had a bunch of undergraduate researchers that helped with this project. So I guess the first time I gave this talk, these data were weeks old, but now the paper is published, so I should have taken that note off of the slide. But basically what we found was that our hypothesis was correct. So what I'm plotting here is the average arsenic in the stems of the rice plant. So this tissue here of the rice plants plotted against the average daytime temperature under which the plants were grown. And so you can see that indeed we're seeing increased arsenic within the tissue of the rice plant as a function of temperature. And that was reflected in our grain concentrations as well. You might be noticing that we're missing data here for the highest temperature. And that was because the plants were so stressed by the heat that they never produced any grain. So heat can, impacts not just arsenic, but can also impact plant physiology as well. What do these concentrations mean? So again, back here to the FDA guideline and that genotoxic threshold. And so basically we were working in a pretty low arsenic system. So kind of leading to the question that the woman asked, maybe it was Beverly, we collected soil from rice fields in California, which are known to be low in arsenic. We grew a California cultivar of rice, which is known to be low in arsenic. And so we had a low arsenic system to begin with. And then what we found though, is that even in these low arsenic systems, as temperatures warm, you can take rice, which you're not concerned about, and then basically move it up into a region where you begin to be concerned about the concentrations within that grain. So our results are suggesting that we should expect kind of concentrations in rice grain to go up as average growing temperatures increase. Okay, so this is like kind of like another piece of bad news about climate change. And, I know a lot of people love to eat rice, and maybe, there's like feelings about anxiety about exposure to arsenic through the rice. And so to kind of offset those anxieties, what I want to point people towards is a really great study put together by Consumer Reports. There's 2 of them, one in 2012, and then the 2014 one, I think, is the more comprehensive one. And they went and studied arsenic in a ton of different rice and rice related products and also other grains, and published those work. And the main take home message is that there is rice which tends to be low in arsenic, or is consistently low in arsenic. And that includes basmati rice grown in India, Pakistan, and California. So I would suggest when you're at the grocery store to focus on buying basmati rice grown in these locations. That is what I do when I buy rice in the grocery store. And then also sushi rice grown here in the United States. Okay, so those are the rice products which are the right ones to be focused on and buying. And then consistently what they found is that rice with the highest levels of arsenic is rice grown here in the southeast of the United States, like I mentioned, where we have these contaminated fields where we applied arsenic-based herbicides in the past. So this includes rice grown in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Okay, so those, that's kind of rice that you should avoid. And then in general, you should try to avoid brown rice. And so I know that's like a little counterintuitive because we've been told brown rice is healthier than white rice. But it turns out that most of the arsenic sent up to the grain of the rice sits in that outer part of the rice grain, that brown part of the grain. And so when they polish the rice and convert it from brown into white, they basically end up removing a lot of that arsenic, physically peeling off that outer bran layer where most of the arsenic is. And so that polishing process ends up removing a lot of the arsenic. So I tend to try to eat white rice and avoid brown rice when possible. And then if you really, yes, oh, Barbara, not Beverly, sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I like Beverly. That's a good name. I'll take
It's
it.
like, it's a bee name.
Yeah. So what about like the Thai jasmine Thai rice grown overseas? Is that somewhere in the middle, or like?
It's probably somewhere in the middle. So yeah, the report, they analyze like everything. So if you're a big rice eater, yeah, so I think especially like people who are gluten-free, you know, and are eating a lot of rice and avoiding gluten products. I was going to point you to this. In their report, they actually have like a table system that they've set up. And so they say like, okay, the goal is like, you don't want to have more than 7 points per week. And then they go through and they kind of say like, okay, these different products, you know, and a serving size, what are the points if you're a child or if you're an adult? So, you know, white basmati or sushi rice gives you 1.5 points, right? And so then you can just aim to try to keep your points below 7 in a week. And so this is just a small snippet of this much larger table. So yeah, I think this is a really great resource for people. Okay, so
in the chat from Eldon, by the way, I don't know if you can open it.
Oh, sorry.
I can read it to you. Eldon wrote, I buy low salt rice-a-roni. How is its arsenic? I would guess high, but they buy the cheapest rice.
Yeah, I think we would have to figure out, yeah, where that rice is grown and where it's being sourced from. And then we'd have an idea. We could like go to that consumer reports and get an idea of what that is in terms of arsenic. And again, like, yeah, like if you have one rice meal a week, even if you're eating rice from Texas, you probably will still be under that 7-point limit. Right. So it's really more of an issue for people who are eating rice with every meal, like in Bangladesh, right? Like you have rice with breakfast, rice with lunch, rice with dinner every day, right? So you're like, culturally, there are communities of people who eat a lot of rice, or as I mentioned, people who are gluten-free. So I think it's really like if rice is this super regular staple that you eat. Yeah, so that's when I would really try to pay attention to that. But you go out to a restaurant and they give you brown rice, like I eat it. I feel like, okay, it's, you know, I'm still going to be below probably, you know, that 7-point limit for the week. Good. Lots of good questions. Okay, so we've touched on arsenic in our drinking water, in our irrigation water, in our food system, particularly rice. What I want to do now is move on and talk about arsenic in our aquatic ecosystems. And this actually takes this talk to a very local level here. So I've been talking about, you know, Bangladesh and Asia, rice grown in California and Texas. So this work here, looking at arsenic in aquatic ecosystems, takes place actually here in the Puget Sound. And this is a story, again, of legacy contamination. So we had the ASCE smelter, which operated for almost 100 years just outside of Tacoma, located here. And that the smelting operations, emissions from that came out of the smokestack and then blew across the landscape and settled down into the soils surrounding that smelter. And so the Washington Department of Ecology has a really great program called Dirt Alert, where they went around and measured arsenic in dirt around the area. And this is a map of those concentrations based on their measurements. And what's, I think, really nice is you can see here, like you can put in an address into this Finder window here, type in your address, and then it will take you in. So I just put like a random address in Gig Harbor. It says, okay, that's the address that you put in. And it can tell you, okay, your property is, in this case, located within the plume. The predicted arsenic concentration in the soil around your property range from 40 up to 100 ppm. So 10 ppm is kind of around background levels. So this is elevated above background. And then what's nice is that they suggest actions that you can take to reduce your family's exposure. So again, when arsenic is in soil, the main thing you want to avoid is getting it on your hands and then having that go into your mouth. And so basically the idea is to get the dirt off of your hands, keep the dirt out of your house, mop and dust, try to make sure you don't, if dirt does get into your house, that you're cleaning it up. And then importantly, wash any toys that your kids might be kind of putting into their mouth. And I think, in the really contaminated places, they actually come in and like replace the soil and such for you. So I feel like they have a pretty nice program for arsenic in the dirt. An area that got a little bit overlooked, and I think it's just kind of based on the purview of what different agencies are in charge of, is arsenic in the lakes in the area. So the arsenic settled not just in the soils, but also settled into the lakes and then down into the bottom of the lakes. And so my colleague, Jim Gowell, who's at UW Tacoma, he went around and measured arsenic in the sediments of lakes all around the region. And so each of these dots here is a lake that was sampled, and the concentration of arsenic in that sediment is represented by the size of that circle. So you can see that we do have some lakes with very high levels of arsenic in them. And so what we being a large group of people, which I'm showing here, including people in the College of Engineering. My dad actually came in and helped me dissect fish because he's a fisherman. So I've included him as an honorary member. College of the Environment and down at UW Tacoma. So what we've been looking at is trying to understand, is arsenic in these lake bed sediments moving up into the water and then making its way up into the aquatic food web? And so we've been looking at this for a number of years. And just to kind of step you through what's happening in the lakes, it's the same story I've been telling over and over again. We have arsenic in sediment, we have microbes, which are doing respiration that mobilizes that arsenic, in this case, into the water, which exists down in that lake bed sediment. And then that arsenic, once it's in the water, can diffuse up into the overlying lake water. And then once you have arsenic into the lake water, it ends up being taken up by phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton mistake the arsenic for phosphorus, which is like a needed nutrient for them. And so it's because phosphate and arsenate are very chemically similar. And so they get mistaken for each other. And so the phytoplankton end up taking the arsenic up, and then zooplankton eat the phytoplankton and get that arsenic. And then fish and other organisms, right, are eating the plankton and getting exposed to that arsenic. So that's kind of the general way that arsenic can move through the aquatic ecosystem. And then once we have it in fish, humans can be catching fish and eating them, and then we can get a human exposure through that pathway. So there's another question in the chat. Oh, great. Someone put the dirt alert in there. Thank you. So just to jump to the punch, what our results are showing is that arsenic in the food web, surprisingly, is not directly related to arsenic in lake bed sediment or into the lake water. So this is a little bit counterintuitive to what we were anticipating. And I'm going to step you through why this is the case. And so what I'm showing here is two lakes. So we have Angle Lake and Lake Killarney. They both are heavily contaminated. So this is arsenic in their lake bed sediment. So this is from that picture I showed that Jim Gowell put together. These are two of the most impacted lakes. They each have about 200 parts per million arsenic in them. Notice that this is on a log scale here, this y-axis. So two lakes with equal amounts of arsenic in their sediments. When we look at kind of maximum levels of arsenic in the water column, this is based on sampling the water over time, we see, okay, well, actually it's pretty similar. They have about the same amount of arsenic in their water column. But the data become quite interesting when we then look at how much arsenic is getting taken up in now to the food web. So how much are the phytoplankton taking up? We can see here in Angle on average, the phytoplankton had around 54 milligrams per kilogram, whereas in Killarney, they had 366 milligrams per kilogram. So a pretty dramatic difference, even though, right, arsenic appears to be the same in the sediment and in the water. So what the heck is going on? What we eventually figured out is that this has to do with the depth of the lake, which was, I think, quite an interesting finding. So Killarney, this lake here, is a shallow lake, and Angle is a deep lake. And so what happens in these deep lakes is that in the summer, they become stratified. So basically the bottom water in these lakes becomes like stagnant, and the lake is no longer mixing all the way through during the summertime. And we can get the formation of kind of a dead zone, basically an area of the lake where no oxygen is. And so what happens is that as arsenic makes its way up out of the sediment, it's trapped down here in this dead zone portion of the lake. Whereas in the shallow lake, we don't get this strong stratification. The lake will periodically stratify, but then it mixes up again. And so what we end up with is arsenic making its way and moving throughout the entire water column. And because aquatic organisms need oxygen to survive, most of them are hanging out in this oxygenated water. So that means in these deep lakes, there's this spatial separation between where the arsenic is and where the organisms are. Whereas in the shallow lake, we're getting spatial overlap between the arsenic and the organisms. So importantly, in the shallow lakes, arsenic is in waters with oxygen. And down here, we have arsenic predominantly in waters without oxygen. And so, as I mentioned, we have separation between arsenic and the aquatic life in the deep lake, and then we get overlap between arsenic and aquatic life in the shallow lake. And so what we started to think about was like, well, maybe it's not maximum levels of arsenic that matter in terms of uptake into the aquatic food web, but rather maybe we should be looking at arsenic in water that's oxygenated. And so what I'm showing here now is a plot of average arsenic measured in our lakes in water which has oxygen in it. I'm showing Angle and Killarney, the 2 lakes we're already looking at, and then 2 additional study lakes in the area that we've been researching. The gray circles are kind of every time we went to a lake and sampled. So those are individual sampling events for all of the different lakes. And then the diamonds are showing the average over that summertime period for the 4 different lakes. And then how arsenic in oxygenated water is related to arsenic within phytoplankton. And so what we saw was a pretty good relationship and a positive relationship, particularly when we're looking at average values between arsenic and phytoplankton and average arsenic within oxygenated waters. And so I think this is kind of an important finding with potential policy and management implications. And that is that it appears from our data that arsenic bioavailability is related to not total arsenic in the lake or maximum levels of arsenic, but rather how much arsenic is making it into oxygenated water. And this is relevant because currently water quality guidelines just use that maximum level. And so our results indicate that you could get kind of a better, you could be more protective of the environment and like less harmful for economic or remediation efforts if you focus on arsenic in oxygenated water instead of maximum arsenic. So that way you are not trying to, worrying about lakes where you don't need to be worried or missing lakes where you should be worried. And so if we look back now at the 2 lakes I was stepping you through, and now instead of looking at maximum levels of arsenic, I'm now plotting average arsenic in oxic water, right? We can see now that we do have a difference between our 2 lakes. That now makes a little more sense when we look at arsenic in phytoplankton. And then we can follow that up, arsenic up the food web. This is arsenic in zooplankton, and then arsenic measured in fish from these lakes. And so the first thing you might notice is that as you move up the food web, arsenic concentrations diminish. And so this is opposite to maybe what you're familiar with, like with mercury, which bioaccumulates as you move up the food web. Arsenic, it turns out, like the organisms are actively working to excrete the arsenic from their body. They can do this through urination. And so basically with that kind of active zooplankton actively trying to release the arsenic, and then the fish kind of actively trying to release the arsenic, we get a stepping down, a biodiminishment of arsenic in the food web. But nonetheless, the levels of arsenic that, sorry, another chat. Okay. The levels of arsenic that we're seeing, particularly in the fish and Lake Killarney, are still elevated. So there was a synthesis. I think I jumped a slide here. Okay, there was a synthesis study done in 2006 where they went to 17 different sites, and these were arsenic impacted sites, and looked at levels of arsenic in the fish there. And this is kind of the average that they came up with from that study. And so what you can see is that average arsenic for the fish in Lake Killarney is elevated relative to the synthesis average, whereas, levels in Angle are at or maybe slightly lower than that synthesis average. And then recently we came out with a paper, this is 2021, so recent, where we actually were able to calculate and show that fish in Lake Killarney does pose an increased cancer risk if you're a high consumer. So it's kind of similar to the story with rice. Like if you're catching and eating fish out of these lakes on a very regular basis, then the levels of arsenic that we're finding in those fish could be of a concern. Okay, so there is a question in the chat that says, is there a chemical available to neutralize the effects of arsenic? And so In the environment, no, I don't know. Once it's inside your body, I don't know if they can give you something to help flush it from your system. Honestly, I don't know. But in the environment, metals like arsenic are very persistent. So they basically don't like degrade like other like organic chemicals can degrade over time. And so they kind of just cycle and they stay there. And so the way to kind of deal with it is you actually just have to kind of try to remove it from the system, because here in the lakes, the arsenic goes up into the water, into the phytoplankton, and then those settle back down into the lake bottom. So in the summer, arsenic comes up into the lake, and then in the winter, it drops back down into the sediment. And then the summer, it comes back up, and in the winter, it drops back down. And so there's no kind of net removal of arsenic. It's just kind of cycling and moving through the system. So the way you deal with it is you just have to kind of physically remove it from the system. Let me know if that did not answer your question. Okay, so we've been talking about arsenic in lakes in the Puget Sound, but lakes are contaminated with arsenic around the world. So this map is showing lakes, which I could find in the published literature, which were reported to be contaminated with arsenic due to a range of activities. So we have this herbicide application, mining, smelting, there's growing contamination from industry, particularly in China. It seems to be kind of a growing problem. Volcanoes are naturally occurring systems, and then don't quite remember what other was. And so I think the first thing you'll notice is it appears that most of the lakes exist here in North America. I don't want you to have the impression that most of the arsenic contamination exists here in North America. I think this simply reflects where people have worked. So there's a lot of, right? North America has a strong scientific community. And when we're like, let's go, we want to study a lake, we turn to our neighborhood instead of looking throughout the rest of the world. So that raises the issue that we should be kind of keeping our eyes open and thinking about lakes in other parts of the world that could be impacted with arsenic. And then the other point I want to make is that many of these lakes are the large kind of famous lakes, right? So it's the same thing. Like if you want to go study something and learn something, you tend to turn towards like the Lake Washington or Lake Erie, these kind of big famous lakes. But Lake Killarney is like a tiny little neighborhood lake. So I'm showing the satellite image of this here. And so this is kind of like a densely populated, small, shallow urban lake. And what our data are showing is that, these lakes, which are important resources here in these urban environments, are potentially the ones that are most susceptible to legacy arsenic contamination and impacts associated with that. And so just kind of a call that we shouldn't be overlooking these kind of smaller water bodies. Okay, so just to kind of step through and summarize everything, because I covered a wide range of things. So the take-home message, if you remember nothing else, is that arsenic is impacting water, food, and animals around the world, and also locally here in Seattle. And it's a contaminant that is, not good on the health of people and the health of the environment. The contamination crisis in Bangladesh and West Bengal ended up propelling kind of advancement of understanding of how arsenic behaves in the environment and the extremely negative effects it has on human health. But that had detrimental, and I would probably say unnecessary, health consequences for those living there. Arsenic is not just an issue for drinking water, it's also a problem when we're thinking about rice. and it can affect both the yield and the quality of the rice. Unfortunately, it appears that climate change is going to exacerbate this problem, but fortunately, there is concrete advice that exists for reducing our exposure to contaminated rice. And then arsenic also can contaminate and affect both local and global aquatic ecosystems. And our work is showing that shallow lakes appear to be more vulnerable to that contamination than deep lakes. It's possible that we could begin using arsenic in oxygenated water as a better metric for predicting bioavailability within these systems. And so these were all the various funding sources that I had to support this work. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. This has been a very good presentation. I don't think I can put my camera right now. Does anybody in the audience have questions for Rebecca? I mean, I was thinking about how difficult it has been to, to get to understand how arsenic moves through the environment and why it is where it is, and it has taken the community some time. So, are there other elements that I mean, there are probably many elements in the environment that could be causing other health problems and maybe as complicated as arsenic? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so right, so arsenic is I keep calling it a metal. Technically it's a metalloid, but I think maybe that's a little nuanced for this situation. But yeah, I mean, there like when you're looking at like acid mine drainage, for example, where arsenic is a problem, there's tends to be other metals like cadmium and copper and lead, which are similarly mobilized in the same way that arsenic is. And so in these lakes, in the lakes, for example, we do know that there's high levels of lead also in the sediments. But the lead is not quite as mobile as the arsenic is, right? And so it tends to kind of stay in the sediments, and it doesn't seem to be kind of moving up into the aquatic ecosystem. And so I think that's a good question, Homer. It's usually, it's not just always arsenic operating by itself, depending on the situation.
So there's other chemicals in the byproduct too. Yeah, that was a good question. What's on the lake? Killarney. K-I-L-L.
Oh, we can hear you now, Eldon.
Oops. I better.
That's okay. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so it sounds like my question is removal and proper disposal of arsenic contaminated soils, is that the preferred mitigation, I guess?
So so like for the communities living right by the smelter plume, I think, yeah, they like kind of dug up their soils and put fresh soil in, and then, brought that soil, I'm guessing, to like a hazardous waste management disposal place. In like the lakes, it becomes harder, right? Because then you're talking about coming in and like dredging all of that sediment up out of the lakes. It's a very destructive way to get the arsenic to remove it. So actually one area we're working on, we're trying to get funding to work on, is developing kind of a cheaper way to remove arsenic, a cheaper and less destructive way to try to get arsenic to sorb onto like substrate that we put into the lake, and then you could remove that substrate and basically pull the arsenic off of it and then put that substrate back in the lake and then collect the arsenic. That would, that will take many years to end up ultimately depleting the reservoir of arsenic. But our hope is that by kind of capturing the arsenic as it's coming out of the sediment, we could keep levels in the water lower. And so then there would be less uptake by the aquatic organisms.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, this is a good question. So fish in small lakes like Angle are stocked sometimes a couple times a year. Did I take that into account the time the fish were in the lake when you measured the arsenic in the fish? So great question. Yes, we actually focused, the published paper is sunfish, which I think are not stocked. So the thought was that by focusing on those, we would kind of know that the fish had been in there for its lifetime. And then actually we went out with Department of Fish and Wildlife this summer and did some electrofishing, and we collected multiple different species of fish to try to see if there's variability across different species. And our guess, we have not collected like the trout, which get stocked. But our understanding is that those fish get fished out very quickly. And so our guess is that those fish are probably have much lower levels of arsenic because they just haven't been hanging out in the lake as long.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, that's something that we want to explore for sure. So yeah, our feeling is that this is really more for kind of like the I don't know, yeah, like not the sport fishermen, but kind of the people who are just like fish and eat continually over the year. Those are the ones, and those are the ones we don't quite know how to get in touch with, and we don't know. Anyway, that's what we're working on now, is trying to understand who is catching and eating fish from the lakes, and what fish are those, and how often are they eating that fish, and what are the species and all that. Good questions. Any other questions?
Do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, and I'm please, follow up with me if you are, have any other questions, or if you want me to point you towards the consumer reports or the websites or anything like that. I can put my email.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Oh, well, we have one more question from Barbara.
What is your current research on right now?
So we're continuing this work with the lakes. So we're doing a lot of different things with the lake. So we're looking at like hydrodynamics and like mixing in the lakes. And as I mentioned, we're trying to move forward and think about remediation technology and even setting up screening tools so that we could maybe say like, oh, it looks like these characteristics make a lake particularly vulnerable to contamination. And so then we could like flag lakes of potential concern. So that's kind of the work in the lake area. And then I have other projects looking at methyl mercury contamination of rice and methane emissions from thawing permafrost up in Alaska. Yeah, we have a wide range of different projects happening in the lab.
Do you teach other classes too?
Yeah, I'm teaching this fall. It's called Fate and Transport of Chemicals in the Environment. So it's kind of the physical and the chemical processes that control concentrations and where chemicals end up in the environment. I teach groundwater hydrology and an undergraduate level mass and energy balances in the environment course. And then I'm teaching a new course, which is very different from everything else, called Grand Challenges Impact Lab in Seattle. And we're actually focusing on homelessness. It's like, I'm not an expert on homelessness, but the idea is to take the students through like a design thinking process to tackle a social problem. And it couples engineers with public health students. And so it's teaching students to work on these kind of complicated problems in an interdisciplinary setting. And learning kind of how you tackle problems and solve them. And they actually get to work and engage with an organization that is working on the topic of homelessness and has identified a problem that they need the students to work on. So I taught that for the first time last year, which was fun. Where is Lake Killarney? It is kind of in the Federal Way area. Let's see, I could show you actually.
East of the Tukwila light rail station.
Here. Oh, this map maybe is not. Sorry.
We can see your screen, Rebecca.
You cannot, right?
No.
Okay, I'll share it now. I think it's right here, this big one. That doesn't help much, does it? There's not much information.
The slide that you had showing the lake itself in the neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah,
showed,
that's like Weiser House.
Yeah, up in the upper left-hand side, just above the picture, is the light rail station.
For Tukwila.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So that was just excellent. And I also want to go back to school and take all of your classes.
Okay.
That sounds so cool.
I think there is a way, like people can audit classes. I don't really know the technicalities of it, but yeah.
Thank you. I want to say that it's 7 o'clock, so we can conclude our program. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Welcome to all the
Thank
new.
you. Here's my web. Oh, I see. I was sending it just to Osh. Here's everyone. There's my website.
Yeah, it's great to know all the things that you are doing in the university at the local level. I'm sure that everyone here is very interested in what you're doing. And it was great to do this jointly with the Water Resources group of Seattle, of ASCE. And we look forward to seeing you in other events.
Yeah,
And
thank you. Thank you.
yeah.
And I'm always looking for, connections to, issues and problems that people need some research on. So reach out if you ever find yourself in that position.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.